welcome everybody to episode 11 of the Fires and Grading. I'm Don Smith, excited to serve as the host for this episode with my typical co-hosts here, Garth and Becky. Garth and Becky, how are you guys today?
I'm doing great.
Great, Don. Thanks so much. Looking forward to today's episode.
Yeah, in this episode, we're going to be diving into the words we use with Students Matter. And I know we've referenced this a couple of other times, but joining us today, we have Ken O'Connor, who we know him as the Great Doctor. And Ken is the best-selling author of, you're on the third version of 15 Fixes for Broken Grades, a repair kit for grading now. Just an absolutely foundational work that we use over and over. And you see Becky pulling it up. I know mine is just behind me as well. And there's Garth's. It's really
always in reachable distance.
Yeah, it's considered to be really the foundation. I know going back to, and I think I was a late adopter to the concept. I remember in 2010, folks were saying, we did the book study of 15 Fixes for Broken Grades a couple of years ago. And so that's the first work that always comes to mind when I think about it. But Ken, how are you today?
I'm good today. I started my day with an hour of pickleball, so that makes any day good.
Yes, if I started with an hour of pickleball, I don't know if I'd be moving right now. So that's fantastic that you're up and able to get around. But Ken, the big reason why I think there's a lot of topics that, as being the Great Doctor, that we could talk to you about when it comes to fires and grading, but time and time again, I've heard you reference the words we use with Students Matter. And I know there's some particular words we'll get into in a couple of minutes, but over and over again, we know that we can control the culture and climate of our classroom with the words that we use. And too often, I think in the end, we end up almost acting like we can't control this, but in reality, we can. There's so much we can't control. So Ken, as we kind of jump in, what's one word that jumps out to you that recently you're like, this is a word we need to really talk about how we use it in our schools and our classroom?
Thanks, Don. The word that comes to mind is work. We talk about students working. We talk about them submitting work. And I think that gives too much of an idea of the transactional process that's been involved in grading, where we want to move to the idea that grades are about communication. And so I think we should be talking about students engaging in learning activities and submitting evidence of learning, because I would suggest that's what they're doing. That's what we want them to do. And that's what we want them to understand that they're doing. And I believe that if that was our consistent language, as you just alluded to, it would change the culture, the environment in the classroom.
And so give us the initial example of what we classically hear, and then give us the full example of what it would sound like under the new verbiage from that. And then Garth and Becky, I'm going to put you on the spot of how does the initial one make you feel? And how does the second response make you guys feel?
I think the initial one is often please work on this, or this is what you're going to work on today. And the other one is, please ensure that you submit your work by whatever time on whatever day.
Okay. So Garth and Becky, how does that, I say, Ken, do you have so as you say, how should we talk about it in schools? What does that sound like now?
Well, I think it should sound like these are the learning activities that we're engaging in today, and that would probably go on to talk about a standard and maybe be very, make the standard very clear. So these are the learning activities around standards. And then the other would be you're working on whatever this task is. Please submit your evidence of learning, or you're going to submit your evidence of learning by the end of the period, by October the 15th, whatever.
Garth and Becky, how does the first version of that even bring it back to your days of being a student? And what is the second? Talk to that a little bit.
I think for me, and I know I've been fortunate enough to have some really great conversations with Ken about the words we use, and he's one that's really made me think differently about it. I still catch myself doing it. I know that, but it's still just good. I know the more we practice it, right, the more that we won't use or will make that change. But I do really think, if you really stop for a moment, because I know as a teacher, when I said those words, it's just what I said. Like, I didn't necessarily think about what I was saying. It's like, okay, you have work time, right, for the rest of class, or you're going to, just like you said, Ken, work on this. I want you to submit that work when you're finished. And I didn't even think of how you could say that differently, or how that could be maybe interpreted, until actually I heard Ken talk about that at probably quite a few years back, at one of the sessions we had at a virtual conference. And I really do think, if you pause for a moment, that it really focuses the language to learning, which is ultimately what we're trying to achieve in our classrooms anyways. And I think the more, we talk a lot about the language of learning in other conversations with the Stager Center, but I think this is something that really changes the perspective of what we're asking kids to do. And I think that just adds to a more positive environment. When we don't always think positive when we think the word work, I guess, like it could be interpreted a lot of different ways. But when we talk about learning, we know that that's ultimately our goal in school. So I love that idea behind that. I just need to get myself to do it more often.
I think it's that concept of thinking about engaging in a task versus understanding what that task represents, right? And so I don't know why this just came in my mind, but I know we like to use analogies a lot on the show. And I'm thinking about if we went to a mechanic and they said, we're just going to work on your car, versus we're going to change your oil, replace the cabin filter, et cetera. Like, we know specifically what the outcome is that's coming as a result of that task. And so I think that's really helpful, Ken, when I think about, too often we just talk about engagement in the task itself of doing something, versus what is it actually in relation to, and how does the production of something from that relate to the standards that we're aiming for in that class?
And then, as we're thinking about, I know we do a lot of work now with schools on, are we holding students accountable to the learning, or are we holding them accountable to the completion of the task? And Ken, that's immediately when I think of when we talk about the use of the word work, is at that point, it's about the completion of the task, is what the message that we're sending of what matters. It's not about the learning that we're trying to do in that moment in terms of what matters. So that's kind of want to just ask you guys, what do you also guys think? What are those hidden messages we're sending? Like we would say, like the unintended message we're sending, like we're trying to say this, but we're actually saying this. Any thoughts on that? And from any of you at this point, yeah, Ken?
I think the unintended message when we talk about work is, as I suggested, it's about what traditionally has been the transactional nature of assessment and grading. You do this and you'll get this, in a sense, reward. You work to be paid. That gives a really false idea of what the classroom is or what it should be about. But, traditionally, especially when teachers use percentages and calculate averages, that's what it's been about, that transactional approach. And that's what we're trying to move away from. So it seems to me, if we're trying to move to the idea of getting away from compliance, focusing on the learning, as Becky said, then that's the language we should be using. We should be getting away from we're getting away from the old language when we talk about learning. So we should get away from the old language in terms of words like work.
And I know, Ken, you've also talked about the difference between assessment and evaluation. Can you dive into what those words mean to you, and how, as we think about education?
To me, and I think the classic definition of assessment is that it's about gathering information. As a teacher, we're gathering information about where the student is in their learning, and then we're going to help them to move forward in that learning. I mean, the root meaning of assessment, the Latin word assidere, is to sit beside. So the root meaning is the teacher sat beside the learner and gathered information and helped them to move forward. Whereas evaluation is when we make judgments about how well something has been done at that point in time. And I think the problem with our language is that, and I'll use this example, in the 90s, my title in a school district, or part of my title, was Coordinator of Assessment and Evaluation when I had that position. somewhere about the end of the 90s, early 2000s, we stopped saying assessment and evaluation, recognizing the two different parts, and just started using the word assessment. Very rarely now do you hear people talk about assessment and evaluation. But I think it's critical that at least teachers understand that if we say assessment in our 2025 context, it really has two distinct parts to it.
So and that's where kind of love having you on here and put your coaching hat on. So then when you are talking to a teacher, what should it sound like when they then are working with their students?
I think what you're referring to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Don, is that ongoing, second to second, minute to minute in the classroom when students are engaging in learning activities, that we communicate with students in appropriate ways. And some of the time it will be they might be doing things that are fairly difficult for them. And we will wander around and we will give them feedback on what they're doing and how it's going. And that actually is probably, 2 minutes of that with a student compared with the feedback, for example, that we give in more formal ways is probably actually the best feedback that students get during the learning process.
So as a teacher sitting there and they have, I guess when we talk about assessment or evaluation, I was just curious on, is there a different, how would you have that teacher introduce the assessment or the evaluation? Like, how would you have, when they're using those words in the classroom, because they have the meanings, how would you have them use those words?
I think that we should take a holistic view of all of the evidence of learning that students produce over any given period of time. But the evidence that we use to make judgments should be primarily the evidence from summative assessments. And actually, Jay McTighe has suggested what we should be doing is calling those evaluative assessments. In other words, really using the two words, but combining them in a slightly different way. And I think that might help if we talk about the difference between just say assessments or practice, and then evaluative assessments might help to get a better understanding of the purpose of each. That one is about giving students feedback, and students giving feedback to one another. The other is this is going to be scored and it's going to be part of your grade.
Garth and Becky, what thoughts do you guys have on that?
I wonder too, Ken, I'm just thinking like from, also we talk about using the words with students, but also, like we have parents and families. And so my wonder is then like, how would you recommend like kind of with those difference of the words and when to use, like how, like talking about evaluation versus assessment, like how can we also get families to understand the language too? Because I know sometimes language is also a barrier, where we go in, and I know you've probably had those experiences too, like where we walk into schools and, working with them on whatever their goals are around grading and assessment reform. And sometimes, we use one word and somebody else, the school district uses a different word. And for some teachers or some that can be families also, like that's a dead stop in the tracks. You said a different word. Now everything's just kind of thrown out the window. So I'm wondering, like, as teachers, as we start to change that language, do you have any recommendations of like, how do we bring families or like the school culture around to also changing that language to get us all on the same page?
Well, I think the first would be teachers using the language consistently. And secondly, our best communicators with parents getting our students to use the language in the ways that we have suggested. And then I think from a school point of view, it is using whatever methods of communication we know are effective with our community, whether it's, the weekly newsletter that goes home or whether it's on the website or, because in different places, different means of communication are more effective. But I think, the more we communicate about it, the better. But, teachers consistently getting students to use the language and then various communications to parents. Would you think that's the way to go, Becky?
Yeah, I know it just brings up in our last episode, one of the things we ended up talking about were just defining, like we always want to say why we're doing something, but what does that mean to us as a district? What is our purpose statement? But then also we brought up, it's so important to define what it means to us, because it may mean something different somewhere else, whether we agree or disagree with how somebody else defines something, but we want everybody to have an understanding. So we just talked about that in our last episode about what does it mean to us? So what is that language? And so then we can all use that common vocabulary, because like we said before, sometimes that does stop people in their tracks. Like, you called it this and I called it that. Oh my gosh, we can't no, we mean the same thing. We just defined it a little bit differently, but being clear about that, I think is what I'm kind of getting as the takeaway.
And that's why early in the repair kit, there's a section on words matter. And when I do workshops, very early in the workshop, I always do a little piece on this is how I understand the words, and this is how I'm using them. And probably the main one for that is grades and marks, because and I think our most problematic words are the words that have double meaning, apart from work, because in your context, grades have a double meaning. They're what teachers put on individual pieces of student evidence, and they're the summaries on report cards. You use the same word for both. Where I live, as you know, in Ontario, we use the word marks for both. And so in each case, we're using one word with a double meaning. And I think most of the time, what it actually means is fairly clear from the context. But I think sometimes it's not clear. And then you do get into a messy conversation.
Yeah, one of the things I think that is just really helpful from even just that conversation alone for our listeners, and this kind of ties back even to an episode we released 2 weeks ago around some potential, the neighboring district did it and they weren't successful, and we started talking on that episode, Ken, about what are some of the factors that lead to a district not having success with it. And part of the goal from that episode is to help schools that are going through the process to not have that same experience. And I think one of the key pieces is that communication around the language, right? The language that we're using. I've walked into a lot of schools where I'll maybe go from, the district has brought us in, or maybe coaching between different buildings, and I'll hear one set of terms in one building and a whole different set of terms in another building. As simple as even the difference between they're calling it, let's just say, standards-based or proficiency-based or evidence-based, even within the same district, which then just creates more confusion along the way. And so I think that's a really important piece is for the listeners, make sure that you have crystal clear language in all forms of communication, whatever it is, from the classroom level to the building level to the district level, so that we don't have those breakdowns. But I know one thing I really want to make sure that we can also get to here, Ken, before the end of the episode, is we've often had conversation back and forth around the words policy versus procedure or practice, because I think that sometimes that those words kind of get muddled together a little bit. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you mean when you say just make sure that we have an understanding of policy versus practice and procedure?
I think that the way we should see policy is that they're broad statements of general intent. They're basically whatever the head person in an organization is responsible for. So that what the superintendent is responsible to the board, what the principal is responsible to the district. They're very broad, they're very general, and they are always, I think, approved by the school board, by the trustees. Procedures are the specifics of how you put those policies in place, the details, and I think those should be able to be changed by administrative regulation. Policy has to have really high-level discussions. This is our policy, and if we're going to change our policy, then it needs those very high-level discussions. But procedures should be about what's going to happen day by day in the schools. And I I think obviously the school board should be informed about those, but I think that is the decision of the administration.
Yeah, no, and I think an important piece for our listeners is I know, and if I were to go back and probably look at maybe a version of my syllabus that I would have given to my high school students, I probably would have had something in there that said, "Here's my grading policy," but it was my policy. It wasn't school policy, and I think that's something that we have to make sure that those are some words that we have to pay attention to because, as Ken mentioned here, it's really what are the procedures of how we implement the policies within our classroom. So I think just that differentiating discussion there is important for our listeners to take into consideration because that is also something, in my opinion, that can derail communication in terms of how people are putting that language out to their students and caregivers, et cetera.
And to make that specific, thinking of the repair kit, the 15 fixes, the policy might be grades will be calm, consistent, accurate, learning focused, and meaningful. That's an appropriate policy statement. But the 15 fixes, maybe rewritten a little, would be the procedures.
Yeah, I was just going to give one other example of that because I know, Ken, you helped me with that with some work we were doing around reassessment. And I had always used the word, this is my reassessment policy in my classroom. And so that was just an example of how well, no, that was my reassessment procedure. The policy would have been that, as a district, we are, all adopting that students have an opportunity to be reassessed. Like that's our agreement, but how we bring that to life in our classroom actually became my procedure, not my policy. So just sharing another example of putting those two words in context as a teacher working through how that was helpful for me to be able to see and understand that difference as well.
As I just want to jump in one last, we're getting closer to our ending here already, which is crazy, but let's say we're filming a movie. Okay, you guys, in this movie, at the very end of the movie, it's a teacher in a classroom and it's all the students saying, will this be graded or will this be on the test? Okay. And then they jump, they backwards, reverse the whole movie, go back to the beginning. What words do you think are throughout that movie that lead to that culture in that school, in that building? When we talk about words matter, what are those words that are the key ones that end up building that culture of will this be graded? Will this be on the test? This idea of we're chasing grades, we're not, and we're chasing points. What are those key words? I was kind of curious what each of you think about that. Ken, can we start with you?
I would want, if I was the building head, the principal, whatever, I would want my teachers to be very clear that except right at the end of semesters or years, they should be using words with students, not symbols. We don't talk about student getting a 3. We talk about proficiency. And I think if that's the language we use, then it doesn't lead to what you said in terms of it just being about the score and it does this count. So the more we can use words, not symbols, the better. And I heard this the other night when people were talking about students getting 3s and 4s and that they weren't having very good discussion. Well, if they talked about students being proficient or excelling, then that would have led to a much better 2-way or 3-way conversation.
Garth, Becky, what other words do you think are used along the way that lead to that? And what other words or what other phrases should we use instead?
First thing that comes to my mind is the use of points. That people, again, because they see it as a value exchange along the way. And by the way, Don, I hope you come up with this movie. It's one that I will definitely go to the theater to see. But I think a lot of times, again, we see that we've talked about this on the show in the past. We see the action itself as something that we need to exchange some form of currency for. So then they see it as I complete this, therefore you give me some type of a value. So then again, will this be graded is really, am I receiving compensation for the action of doing this? And so I think that's a big piece that sometimes leads up to that statement.
And that's really where my brain was going to, of it all really leads or stems back to points, which has to do with the word grades, grading, I guess, and how we interpret and utilize that word. But that's, my mind was kind of going to the same place Garth's was with that transactional of, I say you do, I give, I say you do, I give, I say you do, I give. And, and that's kind of what we've been programmed to for so long. I will say, based off of our experiences of maybe while we were in school, maybe while we started teaching. I know that was me before I knew how to do anything, before I knew differently. That's just because, and it's because it's what I was familiar with. So I just thought that's what you're supposed to do.
So I think that shift that Ken kind of alluded to earlier also will help with that conversation, Don, when we begin to think of assessment as evidence versus evaluation. And I think that is a key part in that discussion to help kind of change that mindset.
So Ken, one question I want to just ask you directly here is, a lot of times we end up working with high schools, and I have what I think is the answer to this, but I'm curious how you would respond to is, a lot of times the high schools say, by the time they get to us, the culture is already set. The kids, that's all they're doing is chasing points and chasing grades. We can't change that. What do you think, Ken? Can they? Excited to have my thoughts on it. I'm curious and then can they? And if so, how could they do that?
Well, I think the kids have been trained into it, because somewhere about the middle of elementary school, they start getting points on everything, and it becomes part, and so it is part of the culture. But if that's the case, I would suggest that the high school has the responsibility to train them out of it, because they know that's not what's going to help them get through high school in a way that's successful and be successful in whatever they do beyond high school. We want to develop students as self-regulated learners. I was thinking when you were saying that, Don, if those students come into the high school with other inappropriate behaviors, then the high school absolutely is going to try and change or clamp down on those behaviors. So if you know that it's inappropriate, you have a responsibility to deal with it at the high school level, it seems to me.
That's absolutely fair. I love that the quick analogy at the end there. That's a great way to put it. Garth or Becky, anything you want to add on to that too?
No, I love how you just stated that. Yep.
and the one thing I always say too to high schools is, first start with your classroom. What are the words you use with students? And do you catch yourself on a path where you have to do this assignment because it's part of your grade, or you have to do this because it'll be on the test? And if you catch yourself saying those things, stop and reflect and think about, what's a different way that we could say it? Are we saying that this assignment here, what we are practicing and we're getting to, it's connected to this learning target. And as you self-assess where you are right now to this helps you develop your knowledge base of that. Or are we saying you have to do this because it's going to be on the test tomorrow? There's a big difference. And I say, you check yourself, but then as a building, we can come together as a high school building. I do believe we can change that. Just like as you said, Ken, I think it's firmly possible. And but it takes then all of us coming together. If you still have massive pockets of chasing points and using those as characteristics, I think it's really hard. Ken, anything else you want to add on to that?
And we know we're successful when we have students and parents coming to us and saying, how can I improve my learning, not how can I improve my grade?
Yes, that's a fantastic note, I think, to end on, Ken. It's when we have students and parents come to us, how can I improve my learning versus how can I improve my grade? So we just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us. We know we could go on forever about words and all the words we use. And I know it's a very quick episode here, but in 2 weeks, the episode will be coming out. I think we're going to be taking questions from the audience. And that'll be our topic that we're going to be fielding, is just what are current burning questions that folks have around, no pun intended there with the fires and grading, but what are those hot topics that we see popping out? So Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you coming in to talk about words. And if folks don't have their copy yet of the 15 Fixes for Broken Grades, Becky, put it up one more time. We highly recommend you get this. As Ken said, there's a whole part just dives into the words. So Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.